Good evening and welcome to this evening's discussion. Our format this evening is very much a conversation rather than a series of set-piece presentations, so join me in welcoming our guests in the usual fashion: Charles Berger, Saul Eslake, Maureen Horder, Mark O'Connor and Marcus Spiller, and I will introduce them fully in a moment. Recently, Australia's population has been growing at around 2% per annum. Now, it might surprise you to know this is faster than the rate of population increase in either India or Indonesia. If that 2% were to continue, Australia's population would double within 4 decades. So, not 36 million by 2050, but 44 million. There are two drivers of growth. The first is high fertility rates. Australian women are having on average 1.97 babies each. This is the highest rate of fertility recorded in Australia since 1977. And it puts Australia a bit ahead of middle-income countries like Brazil or Iran, substantially ahead of European nations like Germany or Greece or Italy or Spain, and well ahead of developed countries in Asia like Japan, South Korea and Singapore. But the even more powerful driver of population growth in Australia is high migration intake. Melbourne is Australia's fastest growing city, on track to have a population between 7 and 8 million by 2050. So will Melbourne still be marvellous with twice as many residents? The same type of issues are confronting other cities around Australia. So let me put that question to each of our panellists in turn, and I'll introduce them to you as we go. Will Melbourne still be marvellous with twice as many people in 2050? Charles, or Chuck Berger, as he prefers to be known, Chuck, is Director of Strategic Ideas at the Australian Conservation Foundation, one of Australia's leading environmental groups. He's formerly a corporate lawyer in New York and Brussels, and he now leads the ACF's research to address the underlying drivers of environmental degradation: unsustainable consumption, growth in resource use, and population pressures. Chuck Berger, will Melbourne still be marvellous in 2050 with 7 or 8 million people?
Thank you, Peter, and I'm confident that Melbourne can still be marvellous in 2050. There's a very understandable interest in knowing what the magic number is on this topic. What's the perfect population for Australia? What's the perfect population for Melbourne? And whenever we talk about that perfect number, I'm reminded of a scene in an American Western drama called Deadwood, where the proprietor of a very disreputable establishment, Al Swearingen, is trying to bribe a local magistrate. And he says to the magistrate, "So, what's the number here that we should be talking about? What's the right number?" And the local magistrate thinks for a minute and responds, "Well, Al, to define the right number in these circumstances is highly liable to be an ongoing process." There isn't a magic number that we can divine for Melbourne for 2050. The best work of our demographers and economists and planners, and for that matter environmentalists, is lucky to be right 5 years in advance, much less 40 years in advance. So I think what we need to think about is, what can we do today that will maximize our chances that Melbourne is going to be an ecologically sustainable city, a culturally vibrant city, a city with a very high quality of life on out into the future, whether that's 2020 or 2050 or 2100. And I'd like to make 2 suggestions of things that we can do today. The first is to very clearly identify what is it about our environment that's non-negotiable, what is it that we love and value and will demand protection for. And let me just give you a couple of numbers to put that in perspective. First of all, on water. Melbourne has set a target of 155 litres of water use per person per day. If Melbourne grows to be a city of 7 million people, then that target would have to fall to 89 litres per person per day by 2050. And if we take into consideration the fact that water supplies are probably going to decrease as a result of climate change, then we're really probably looking at a 70 or 80 litre per person per day water use target. When it comes to pollution, the federal government has a target of 60% reductions in pollution by 2050. If Melbourne grows to 7 million people, then we're really talking about an 80% reduction in per-person emissions levels. And again, as the science develops, that may well become more ambitious. And finally, when we talk about land and biodiversity, which is really where the rubber hits the road, Victoria has over 150 threatened animal species alone. Many of those live on the fringes of our urban centres and in our coastal regions, which are heavily stressed by population growth. So if we want to preserve those species, those critical and precious and wonderful creations of nature, then that is all the more challenging with a very rapidly growing population. So let's define our environmental constraints, what it is that we want to protect, and work backwards from there. Figure out what that implies for the kind of lifestyle that we want to lead and the kind of city that we would like to have. Very briefly, the second major suggestion I would have here is that we really have to do away with the concept of bigger is better. A bigger house is not necessarily a better place to live. A bigger city is not necessarily one that delivers a higher quality of life. And most importantly, a bigger economy is not necessarily better for the people that are working within that economy. We really do need to focus on growth in our quality of life rather than growth in a particular macroeconomic indicator. I think that's the biggest challenge for us, and the thing that we can do that will most improve our chances of having an ecologically sustainable future.
Thank you, Chuck Berger, the Director of Strategic Ideas at the Australian Conservation Foundation. Saul Eslake was Chief Economist with the ANZ Bank for 14 years before leaving in 2009 to become Director of the Productivity Growth Program at the Grattan Institute. That's a non-aligned policy think tank affiliated with Melbourne University. Saul Eslake also sits on many public boards and advisory councils, and he's a very proud Tasmanian. Saul Eslake, will Melbourne be still marvellous in 2050 with 7 or 8 million people?
I think it will be different, Peter. Whether it's marvellous or not will depend on the decisions which governments, the council and the community more broadly takes about how they want to live over that period and by that time. In just the same way as life in London or New York, populations 7 to 10 million are different from life in Melbourne today. If we have 7 million people in 2050, then life will be different from the way it is in Melbourne today. Certainly there will be more things to do. And given that if we do have a population of 7 million by 2050, the people who have come here will be quite different from those who are here at the moment. There'll be a bigger variety of things to do, and I think both of those will be positive. But the fact that there will be more people wanting to do them means that it will be more expensive to do them. Doing them will feel more crowded, and people will probably have to travel further and take longer in order to get to the things they want to do. And by that I mean work, eat, shop, enjoy themselves and all the other things that go to make up urban life. I guess just as when Australians go to live in places like London or New York or Hong Kong, they tend to live differently from the way they do here in Melbourne or in other parts of Australia. They tend to live in smaller houses and pay more for them. They tend to use public transport more and be less likely to own their own cars. If Melbourne ends up being the size in 35 years that London is today, then we're probably going to live more like Londoners do today than we do like Melburnians do now. But that will be the result of choices that are made over the period between now and then. More broadly, I'm personally something of an agnostic about the costs and benefits of population growth. I do acknowledge that from a business perspective, population growth means a bigger economy into which they can sell more goods and services and spread their fixed costs more thinly and thus reap economies of scale. On the other hand, it doesn't necessarily mean that people will be better off in terms of crude material measures like income per head, let alone measures which take into account some of the costs of population growth that are harder to measure statistically, but nonetheless which people encounter in their daily lives and which business people often ignore at their peril when they're participating in debates about population growth. I don't think there is an answer to the question, what is the optimal or most desirable level of population? And even if there were, it would trouble me if governments tried to make sure that that number, whatever it was achieved, because I think it would require degrees of government involvement in the choices that people make that I think would be unacceptable. If we talk about governments trying to restrict the number of children that people have, or alternatively to try and induce them to have more than they want to if the target is higher, and similarly governments seeking to restrict the ability of people to move to Melbourne from other parts of the country, or indeed from abroad in a population that globally is going to reach $9 billion people, compared with 6 billion today, no matter what we in Australia might decide to do about that. So I don't think you can stipulate a magic number, and I'm very wary of the things that governments might feel inclined to do if they wanted to achieve some arbitrarily chosen number at some particular point in the future. I think it's more important that we think carefully and plan wisely for what the best available evidence tells us the population's likely to be on current trends.
Saul Eslake, thank you. Saul Eslake is the Director of the Productivity Growth Program at the Grattan Institute, policy think tank affiliated with Melbourne University. Our next speaker is Maureen Horder. She's the Chief Executive Officer of the Migration Institute of Australia. The Migration Institute is a peak body representing migration agents, those people who give advice, professional advice to migrants who want to come to Australia. Maureen Horder, you're in the business of migration, obviously, so I'm presuming you think migration is marvellous and Melbourne will be marvellous in 2050.
Well, let me say firstly, Peter, that the Migration Institute is not a lobby group, right? We are not here as advocates. I don't represent advocacy for migration per se. We simply represent a professional group of people who work with prospective migrants to this country. So I'm not here, let me say that now, necessarily to advocate. Hopefully I can add something, though, from our perspective to the discussion. But as a long-standing resident of this country, let me say that I find this debate a very interesting one. Marvellous Melbourne. Now that's a term I understand. I did my quick bit of Googling before I came today to just check that I understood what that meant. And it came about in the 1880s, as the locals will know, but it came about at a time of great growth in Melbourne. So I think it's quite symbolic that Council has chosen this particular topic, or maybe we accredit it to you, Peter. But certainly Melbourne is marvellous, has been marvellous, and I think as we go forward will continue to be marvellous. Now, just what that will mean, I hope, it's nothing that you've alluded to, Saul, where we've got population controls and measures. I hope that we still have a very democratic, free and open society. So let's get that one off the agenda if we might. But one of the things I would just like to share with the group today is that I come from a family that my parents took very seriously the Caldwell Edict of populate or perish. And so I'm one of 9 children. And some around this table even would think that was wanton and quite selfish of them to have done that. But the point I really want to make is that population is integral to any community and any society. And so we need to look at that issue of, is there any economic growth that any of us can think of that hasn't had associated with it some population growth? I'm now talking about major cities in the world. I cannot think of any, certainly not in the kind of economies we're talking about in Western societies, where economic growth has not been accompanied with population growth. So I'm not necessarily advocating it here, but I'm a realist, and I think if we as a community and society want to be part of a growing Melbourne, a growing Australia, then we have to actually be very realistic about it. I understand many of the arguments, and we'll hear some more about it tonight, about the impacts on the environment. Of course, that's critical. The impacts on society that any population discussion has to go to. Migration is but one element, a key element, and of course historically it's been a major driver to Australia's economic, social and community development, and we cannot deny that. Although we're looking fairly same-like to me around this table in terms of our antecedents, but I'm sure there's a bit of variety there, and I'm sure not everyone here is seventh generation as I am. But after they finished bringing convicts here, which is where my people came from, we did have massive migration. And by about the 1850s, here in this state, we had a greater number of people who were free settlers. And I think that history is important because I think we need to understand that the development of this country, its growth, is dependent on rational, sensible population. So I applaud the fact that we are finally, in my lifetime, having a debate out in the open about population, because I think it really is a most important and most significant one. And for my own part, I do not think if you stop growing, I'll rephrase that if I might. I don't like to think about what happens to Australia or Melbourne if we stop growing. What's that outcome? I'll leave that thought with you.
Maureen Horder, thank you. Maureen Horder is the Chief Executive Officer of the Migration Institute of Australia. Mark OConnor is a professional poet and environmental writer. He's published 16 books of verse, and he also has a long-standing and passionate interest in population. He's written 2 recent books on this particular issue. The first is This Tired Brown Land, and more recently, Overloading Australia, How Governments and Media Dither and Deny on Population, co-written with William Lyons and published last year. And I think the ABC gets a bit of a serve in that book as well. Mark OConnor, will Melbourne be marvellous with 8 million people in 2050?
Thanks, Peter. And it is indeed wonderful to be at last able to have, at long last, a sensible debate on population and interesting and intelligent questions to consider. I don't suspect Melbourne will be all that fabulous if it reaches 7 million. But, Peter, if I were a religious man, I might be a bit reluctant to answer your question. I might fear that there might be in the afterlife some kind of Dantesque area of humiliation for those who commit the sin of presumption in attempting to tell the future. It's a real issue. Our future is real. It's approaching us, but we can't see it. As one of my Australian poetic colleagues brilliantly puts it, the future is the black hole out of which no radiation reaches us. We see by convention a small living distance into it, but all of our projections fail to curve where it curves. He did predict, though, that the real future will never be straightforward and sunny. It will have its unpredicted disasters, its known unknowns and its unknown unknowns, and its September 11s. W.H. Auden said much the same thing in that wonderful poem of his of advice to a young ambitious urban planner, where he wrote, "Suspect those bright mornings when you have never seen so many well-fed pigeons on statues and triumphant cupolas. Remember when your city seems a permanent home for marvellous creatures and great men, what griefs and convulsions startled Rome, Ecbatana, Babylon. At the end of each successful day, remember that the fire and the ice is only ever a day's march from the temperate city." In short, cities, like other organisms, do not last forever, even if we're now so confident that for the first time in centuries we no longer build walls around them. That might be because we know that the walls wouldn't keep out missiles, but it gives us the illusions that our cities are invulnerable, and they are certainly not. So what am I talking of here in threats? I was a fortnight ago at the Inclusive Cities Conference in Melbourne, which we heard from various work groups dominated by enthusiastic planners and by growth advocates, often with some fairly obvious vested interests. But finally it was time for the strategic planning session to speak, and Admiral Chris Barry began remarking, "I'm just a simple sailor, but I think there are 3 elephants in the room. The first is population growth, The second is climate change and what it might do to Australia. And the third is economic growth. And by that he meant the probability that economic growth may have to cease. Now, on that issue he was ahead of me. I'd missed the latest edition of Scientific American with Bill McKibben's very important article, Breaking the Growth Habit, in which he argues that economic growth will have to stop, not because of the damage it's doing to the environment. We're a selfish species. I think we'd go on damaging the environment, but because of peak oil. We have lived in the age of oil. We have multiplied our populations again and again because of cheap oil, and we've grown food from oil, which we turn into fertilisers and pesticides. But it may all have to end fairly soon. So I'm not going to talk to you about the obvious problems that I'm sure we'll get onto, the overcrowding, the impossible housing prices, the roads and so on. I'm going to talk instead about, and this is the last point I'll make, what happens when suddenly oil becomes really expensive, moving from $5 a barrel, which the economists insisted 10 years ago was its natural and inevitable price, up towards $100 a barrel, at which point food riots broke out, as you'll recall. It means we're going to have to put an inquisition to all new cities and all new suburbs in a way we never did before. How is this place to pay for itself and feed itself? It's no longer enough for planners to ask, will there be jobs for the new city's people? But can we promise to keep them alive? If you look at Melbourne's accounts and Victoria's, they're appalling. In the last few years, Victoria's exports have fallen to half its imports, and that's a recipe for disaster. For a city like Melbourne to survive, every 10 years, other parts of the world must be motivated to send it hundreds of thousands of tanker loads of oil, hundreds of thousands of truckloads of food, and in return that city has to produce something that the rest of the world really wants. Well, Melbourne doesn't have many factories anymore. We're a country that basically lives by selling off its minerals, which pushes the dollar so high we can't really export manufactured produce. So we have a city whose inhabitants seem to be doing quite well servicing each other, but who really can't pay for the things they need. That's all right so long as oil and food are dirt cheap, as they have been up till now. But when those absolutely crucial commodities start to be high in price, that will invert. And I think we will be up against a terrible problem where we will start to look at those vast cities and vast suburbs expanding like the suburbs of Lima, going on forever, and saying, what are they for? What can they produce that the rest of the world so desperately needs that it will send Melbourne oil and food?
Thank you. Thank you, Mark O'Connor, poet and co-author of Overloading Australia. Our fifth panellist is Dr. Marcus Spiller. He's the Director of SGS Economics and Planning and a former National President of the Planning Institute of Australia. He's advised governments and taught in universities, and he's an adjunct professor in urban management at the University of Canberra. Marcus Spiller, can Melbourne be marvellous in 2050 with 7 or 8 million people?
Peter, I take as my point of departure a similar set of assumptions to Mark, but I arrive at a different conclusion, and I feel confident that Melbourne will be even more marvellous with a larger population. For me, the issue is not so much the absolute population, but the way in which the city is structured. And I'm suspicious of logic which says, Melbourne at 3.5 million can't cope with the traffic, can't cope with the affordable housing issues, can't cope with the water shortages. Because we must remember that the Melbourne that we see today reflects, if you like, a sort of 1960s all-you-can-eat smorgasbord of cheap petrol, cheap power, cheap land and seemingly abundant water. So Melbourne can't and won't continue to grow in that fashion. But it doesn't mean that we have to embrace some radically different lifestyle, or even that the look of our cities would change significantly. Most of the planning prescriptions are quite clear and well known to us, and they're nothing particularly surprising. Things like we need to put more jobs and more people in transport-rich corridors and nodes. We do need to build the employment base of our suburban areas in order to provide a richer jobs mix, so they're not just consumption-based economies, and we need to build our average, and I emphasise average densities in our greenfield areas. This would provide a significantly more sustainable city without really dramatically changing our lifestyles. In fact, probably about 80% of the Melbourne that we know today would remain largely unchanged. Now, we tend to think of Melbourne as a single city, and we think of it growing to 7 million in an amorphous fashion. But if you consider the way in which people live in our city, that is, where they work, where they shop, where they recreate, Melbourne is actually a federation of about 5 or 6 cities based on journeys to work. Now, these cities at the moment are, if you like, vassals to the centre. There is a dependency on the centre. But at a larger population, these cities will come into their own. They will be able to develop their own vibrant CBDs. Just imagine if we witnessed in your Broadmeadows, your Dandenongs, your Frankstons, your Ringwoods and your Footscrays, the sort of rejuvenation that we've witnessed here in central Melbourne over the past 20 years, the sort of rejuvenation that we all marvel at and enjoy. Melbourne as a federation of 6 cities, each with a vibrant heart, all connected by quality public transport, all providing superior accessibility for all people in community, will be certainly a marvellous city.
Marcus Villa, thank you.